Oh, hi, Judith. I didn't see him. Hi, Judith.
Welcome, and
Mike. Oh, yeah.
we're going to take a look at the Torah Temimah uh, for Noah. We're going to continue where we left off, and
And a broker.
yes, we do. Thank you, Harlan. Absolutely. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok v'divrei Torah. Thank you.
Amen.
Okay, so we are on verse 4 here of chapter 9 of Genesis, and here we go. However, right? So what's happened in this previous verse, right, or previous couple of verses, we were reading how human beings can now consume meat. Meat. In other words, take the life of an animal in order to consume the meat of the animal. But there are, so here's the ach. An ach is a limitation, a however, right? However, basar benafsho, flesh that is alive, right? That is in the nefesh. So this is a very, how can I put it? This verse has a lot packed in it, okay? Damo, its blood, lo tochelu, you shall not consume. Okay,
Mm.
so this sounds so ben nafsho, right? In its soul, very often simply means while it's alive, and we're going to see how that goes. However, the fact that it adds this damo, its blood, we're going to see, is going to refer somehow in a different sense. So here we go. So we've got this ach, and by the way, we've got another ach. These are all limitations, right? So in other words, while you can eat you're allowed to eat now the flesh of animals, the meat of animals, but you're not allowed to eat it while it's alive. That's what this is seeming to say. And in fact, we're going to see right here. Ach basar benafsho. However, meat benafsho, while it is living, right? Basar benafsho. So he says explicitly that when it's talking about meat while it is living, ze ever min hachai. This refers to the limb of an animal while it is still living. And let's just take a quick look, see where there's a footnote there. It's a brief footnote. Here we go. Dekach mashmale. This, in fact, is the implication. Lashon basar benafsho. Just the way you heard me translate it, right? This is the implication of that expression, meat while it is alive. Shelo tochal habasar, that is, you should not consume the meat, but od shehanefesh hachayut bo, that is to say, that as long as the soul, that is, it is alive, right? It is still vital, bo, it was within it. So, in other words, the idea that it's living, saying that it has a soul, is referring to its vitality, its living, its fact that it's living. And this is described by this term, aver, a limb min hachai, from the living, a limb from the living. And the reason why this is even mentioned, and by the way, so what they would do is they would have an animal, they would amputate like a limb from the animal, which didn't kill it, right? Because they didn't have refrigeration, and it was a way in which to consume meat and preserve it, etc. This is actually according to the Torah and according to our interpretation of the Torah, since this is to the descendants of Noah, meaning to humanity, that this is actually forbidden. That this is a negative commandment, a divine negative commandment. And the truth is, there are certain tribes that, in fact, practice this. And we infer from this the whole idea of cruelty to animals, that it is forbidden to treat animals in a cruel kind of way. And obviously, when you amputate a limb from an animal, from a living animal, and it remains alive, now with an amputated limb, or maybe more than an amputated limb, right? This is being cruel to the animal. So, going on. Yachol af ever min hachai bishratzim. So this is it. So maybe we mean that it would include this law of question. Michael, did you have a question? Okay, sorry. Yachol. So of course, just raise your hand and I will try and catch it. Yachol, maybe this comes to include, however, in other words, af ever min hachai b'shratzim, meaning that this law of a living, a limb from a living creature applies also to shratzim. Now, shratzim basically refer to swarming animals. And whether or not we are actually a sheretz here, I believe we are referring to insects. As opposed to, and sometimes shratzim are referred to as reptiles, because actually, if I'm not mistaken, the very term reptile has the same meaning. Oh, not as swarming, but as crawling, something like that. And sometimes sheretz is understood in that way. But it's a difficult word. The Hebrew itself, I'm going to understand that in this context, it refers to insects, right? Basically, those kinds of animals that swarm in that way. Talmud lomar. So for this reason, Scripture states, ach damor, referring to, damor means its blood. Its blood. Mi shedamo chaluk mi basoro, referring to something where its blood is separate from its flesh, from its meat. So just like regular animals, right, have veins and arteries, and the blood is separate from the flesh. Whereas with these particular animals that we're talking about, that we're accepting from this, we're saying that somehow it doesn't have a system, right, a circulatory system. Yatsu shratzim. So this would leave out, right, shratzim. She'ein damam chaluk mibsaram, because in their case there is no circulatory system, right? The blood is not separated from their flesh. Literally, that's what I'm talking about. And this is in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 59b in the Talmud. Let's take a look. Now, he has quite a bit to say about this here. Ritzono lomar. What is it trying to say? Yachol, it would be possible, Yehei nohog gam b'shratzim, isur ever min achai. It would be possible that the prohibition of ever min achai, right, a limb from a living animal, applies also to shratzim. So whatever these shratzim are, and I'm sorry that I don't have a more precise, that I'm trying to guess make an educated guess as to what they mean by shratzim. Excuse me one moment. Let me see if I can, forgive me. Let's add this up a little bit. Okay. Talmud lomar. And for this reason, Scripture says, ach damo, right? So it says, however, its blood. Let's take a look here. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Here, basar damo, its blood. Let's go back here. Okay. Right. Vidarish, and he's interpreting this based on Yitur Lashon Damor. The fact that this word Damor, its blood, is actually unnecessary. Okay, it's redundant. Why? Dahava le'lemar, because it could have said the verse, if the verse had meant any animal whatsoever, including shratzim. Okay, it could have said, ach basar b'nafsho lo tochelu. It could have just said, the flesh of a living animal you shall not eat. So the fact that it adds this word damo, or its blood, well, let's go on. I'm sorry. Let's go on with Torah Temimah's statement. V'hayaba mashma ever menachai. And if it had just said that, without this word damo, it would have implied that we were talking about the ever min hachai rule, right? This limb from a living creature. Ukemoshe katuv b'parshat re'eh. And again, we're going to refer to this when we read Parshat Re'eh. Parshat Re'eh is a parsha in the book of Deuteronomy, and there it says, "V'lo tuchal hanefesh im habasar," where it says, "You shall not consume a living thing with its flesh." Right. V'darshinan sham, and there we interpreted that to mean deka'e al ever min hachai, that verse is a reference to this law of ever min hachai, a limb from a living creature. כמו שכתוב כתבנו באות הקודם, and as we referenced in the previous little section, in this section here, right, when we were reading this one, we were reading this, okay, that we made a reference to Eva min hachai. See here. V'lachen hosif damo, and the reason why the verse adds this word damo, its blood, lomar lecha, to inform you, derak eva min hachai kazeh, that we're only talking about a limb of a living creature like this one. In other words, ne'esar is forbidden, biyichud, specifically. In other words, that it has to have damo, mishum ever min hachai, on account of this law of ever min hachai, the consuming the limb of a living creature. Ze, that is to say, ze shehadam me'oto ever ne'esar, that is, that the blood of that particular limb, ne'esar, is forbidden, gamkein, also, biyichud, specifically, mishum dam, on account of blood. So it's not just the flesh, but also the fact that there's blood in it as well. That is another element of the prohibition. Masha einochen dam, which would not apply, dam shratzim, the blood, quote, quote, of shratzim. Ein damo chaluk mibsaro. It doesn't have, right? Its blood literally means its blood is not separate from its flesh. It doesn't have arteries and veins, right? Klomar, that is to say, im achal dam shratzim, that is to say that if he consumed the blood, quote, quote, of shratzim, eino chayav, he is not going to be guilty, he's not going to be held accountable, mishum dam, on account of the blood, rak mishum shratzim, only on account of the fact that he was eating the limb itself. In other words, let me clarify that here. What he is saying is that the addition of the word dam means that we have two prohibitions here. We have the one of the fact that one is consuming the limb itself, that is the flesh, and we have another prohibition that one, in doing that, in consuming the limb of a living creature, that there is also blood in that limb that we are also consuming, and that is another prohibition. So in other words, this damor is a second prohibition, right? Now, I think what this is saying, essentially, it isn't giving you permission to do this, if I'm understanding him correctly. What he's saying simply is that technically one is not liable for the blood of, that if one eats the limb of a living sheretz, one is not guilty of the dam part of it. You're only going to be guilty of the one. But let's see, let's keep going. That's my understanding of the word, somewhat of a technical distinction, a legal, somewhat legalistic, okay? Ya'an, for the reason, kishe huz haru Yisrael, right? That when the Jewish people were forbidden al shratzim, they were forbidden to eat shratzim. And in this case, I don't need to translate shratzim as insects. I can understand shratzim as referring to reptiles, right? That's what we're understanding, and we can understand it here. Lo huz aru mishum dam. They were not forbidden to eat these shratzim because they had been forbidden to eat blood. Jews, as you know, when we read in Leviticus, we are told specifically that we are not to consume blood, okay? So in these case of these shratzim, they were not being forbidden to eat it on account of the blood, ela mishum shiratzim, shratzim, kebasar, right? So we'll see what it is. Okay, that they were being forbidden only on account of the fact that they were shratzim. Kebasar, okay, let's see, like meat, uchamor dekai malan bechritut kaf aleph. He's giving a reference here that we have a halacha, that we find a law in a halacha in this tractate Kritut kaf aleph, page 21b, Dam shratzim, when it comes to the blood of shratzim, hitrubo, it is permissible, mishum sheretz luka, okay, on account of sheretz, of that's that's a singular of shratzim. Luka, he is given lashes. Mishum dam eno luka. So mishum sheretz luka, he will be given lashes on account of having eaten a reptile, which he's forbidden to do as a Jew. Mishum dam eno luka, but he is not beaten. He's not given stripes on account of the blood, of consuming the blood. Okay, so it's saying specifically there we have another example he's giving us of a case where we're really talking about two prohibitions. And there it's very clear that the prohibitions are separated, and as far as the blood element of it, it doesn't even though we're forbidden to consume blood, it is not referring to the blood of shratzim. V'lachein, and for this reason, eino chayav be'avarehem, right? And that is, he is not going to be guilty, right? Having committed a sin regarding their limbs, gam mishum ever minachai, from both the issue of ever minachai, okay, rak mishum shratzim, but only on account of the fact that it's sheretz. So it's getting quite technical here, but we are talking again about separating out the prohibitions that are involved.
So, question?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, maybe I'm getting lost, but
no, I don't blame you if you are. Go on, please.
Is the prohibition against reptiles? Is it basically taking off the limb while they're alive, or is it prohibition against them in general? It seems like there are multiple things in play here that we've talked about in the last few minutes, right? There's the part about taking off a limb of a live creature, can't do that. Then there's the limb in the blood, can't do that. Then there's the reptile. So anyway,
yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. My understanding here, okay, as I'm trying to puzzle this out, and I'm with you to some extent, David, as I'm trying to, figure out what we're saying, is that in the case of Jews who are forbidden to eat shratzim, he's giving a very different kind of case here, but he's trying to support the idea that when it comes, that as far as the law here in Genesis, okay, then what we're being told in the Talmud here is that while he may be forbidden because of Ever Minachai for eating a reptile, okay, this is a non-Jew now, right? Two different cases. Non-Jew, he will not be guilty of having consumed the blood, whereas a non-Jew who eats who from a regular animal, right, eats a limb of a living animal, is guilty both of eating the limb of a living animal and its blood. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And if a non-Jew eats a reptile, he is only guilty of eating the limb of a reptile. He is only guilty of eating the limb of a reptile, but not guilty of consuming its blood.
Because the circulatory system is
correct.
Right.
And he's giving as an example, of a Jew who eats a reptile, okay? And eats the limb of a living reptile. Okay, that he will not be he is not going to be guilty, even though a Jew is separately also forbidden from eating blood, from consuming blood. In a case of a Jew eating a reptile, the limb of a reptile, right? In other words, he's also obviously a Jew is also forbidden from eating the limb of a living animal, right? Certainly a Jew is also forbidden from doing that. There's no reason why a non-Jew would be forbidden that, but a Jew would be allowed to do it. But the issue he's saying right now is in a case of a Jew who's also forbidden from eating reptiles, period. You follow me?
Mhm.
If a Jew eats the limb of a living reptile, he's not guilty of consuming the blood, just like a non-Jew. He's not guilty in this case of eating the limb of a living animal because he's already forbidden to eat a reptile, period.
Oh, okay. Okay. So it's a precedence, right? It's
Yeah,
which thing comes first and
right.
which most, I'm going to guess, most severe in terms of the way it's okay. Thank you.
So he's giving this other example just to show that in a case where something may not be forbidden, it doesn't mean you can go ahead and do it. It just means that particular element isn't forbidden.
Yep. Makes sense.
Okay. So the question is, what is a guilt? What when a person is taken to trial for having committed something, right? And in this case, let's assume we're talking about a Jew who has eaten the living limb of a reptile. Okay. He is not going to have to, because there counts, right? When you take someone to trial, you separate out the things that the person has done wrong, and there are possibly consequences for each of the separate things they've done wrong. Okay. So what's he done? A Jew who's eaten the living limb of a reptile. He's consumed the limb. He's also consumed whatever blood is there, okay, is part of that limb. And he's also consumed a reptile. He's not allowed to do any of those things. And technically now he's not going to be punished for having consumed the blood or consumed the limb because he's going to be punished for having consumed a reptile.
Right. So you threw out the other two counts, right?
Correct.
The most serious count is the one that he's
That's
going
going to count, right? But that isn't always the case. In
That's
law,
true.
that is not always the case, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Vitam hadavar, he goes on to say, this is technical, but hopefully, as we're talking about it, it's becoming clear as to what are the issues going on here. Vitam hadavar, and the reason for this, mishum de kamo ever min hachai, right? That just in this case, we're talking here still about a Jew who ate the limb of a living reptile, right? Mishum de kamo ever min hachai, that just in this case, that just as they were talking about the limb of a living reptile, kach dam minachai. Okay, so we are talking about blood from a living animal. Inyan echad, it is one lahem. Okay, there's one issue going on here. Sheyesh bahem chayut hanefesh. Because so the reason why I think what he's saying here is that the reason why we talk about the limb of an animal and the blood of an animal, okay, is because in both the cases they affect the life of the animal, right? Yesh bahem chayut nefesh. That is the limb, both removing the blood, both removing limb, have to do with the fact that the animal is alive. Umikevan she'en chiyuv b'damam, and since there is no, in this case of the reptiles, I believe he's talking about, there is no obligation regarding their blood, mishum dam, on account of the blood, ein chiyuv gam be'evrahem, right? Likewise, there is not going to be a chiyuv, an obligation regarding their limbs, mishum ever min hachai, on account of the fact that you removed a limb of a living animal. V'ien od lefanenu, and see further before us, but Parshat Re'eh, in this parsha that we referred to in Deuteronomy, but Pasuk HaNizkar, in the verse that we referenced, which is chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, verse 23. And I believe he is still talking about a Jewish person. In other words, when it comes to a non-Jew who eats the limb of a living reptile, okay, they are going to be guilty. If I'm understanding this correctly, they aren't going to be guilty of the blood, of consuming the blood of that reptile. They will be guilty of having consumed the limb of a living reptile. And in a case of a Jew, because they're forbidden to eat reptiles, period, they're not going to be guilty of consuming the blood and consuming the limb. That's how I'm understanding this. I may be wrong. Having said all that, I could be misunderstanding this, but this is my level of understanding this particular Torah Temimah at this particular time. Okay? Any thoughts, any comments? All right. I think we're going to, this might be a good place for me to give you a chance to breathe. So let me mark the place, and we will in fact take a look at the next passage tomorrow in here. Okay. So there we are. I'm going to stop the share. Okay. Be honest with me. Was this starting to make any sense at all? Was I able to extract any sense out of this?
Yes, you definitely did. The
Okay.
blood, don't drink the blood, don't eat the blood, and don't eat the limbs of a live animal.
Right. But there are three. So for a Jew, there are three prohibitions. For a non-Jew, there are two prohibitions.
Yeah, I don't think Jews have to worry because we have a dietary laws. We go by that.
Well, we have to worry because we got more to break.
Yeah.
Was the real purpose of this also to establish judicial precedents? I mean, that's what it almost sounded to me like. They're
Yes.
using it as an example also of how do you set up a judicial system, right? Is that, I don't know if that's part of it or not.
Well, I don't know that I'd have to think about that, but I would say if I'm understanding you correctly, there's no question that is talking about judicial theory here in some ways, right?
Right.
In other words, how does one, make sure that there is justice and that you want to, and of course it's all ultimately coming from how you interpret this biblical verse and looking at it very, very carefully. But the truth is that when somebody comes to court, and is being accused of certain things, I think there's a tendency that if there's a chance of minimizing, not maximizing, but minimizing the counts, you want to minimize the counts. Okay. It doesn't mean it becomes permissible. It just means you don't have to, on a technical level now, add to the counts of which this person is guilty and is consequently going to have to, account for. And
I'm imagining that there's probably dispensation if it was to save a life.
Yeah, I think there would be, though, that saving a life under most circumstances is an exceptional situation. That is totally on its, it's a one of a kind of thing. Yes. But Jocelyn, in a sense, the point you're making though is really important in the sense that you have to look at circumstances. You have to look at all the issues that are involved in a particular case and what's included and what isn't included, even from a legal point of view. Mike?
What about in Japan where they eat live fish?
So again, that's a good question.
Live fish or raw fish?
Yeah, raw fish is not the same as live fish.
They do both actually. They will.
What about
live.
kids who swallow live goldfish after the goldfish are given as prizes?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I heard that.
yeah.
Little fish are swimming in alcohol and they drink it and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
Ew.
I can't imagine that the fish can survive too long in the alcohol.
No.
Yeah.
So, Mike, I'd say it's a good question. I mean, based on what we're reading right now, what do you think? At least according to the Torah, is this an appropriate way to behave?
Well, I heard fish belong to a different class of.
They do. You don't have to shecht fish. Fish that are kosher don't need to be shechted. They tend to basically asphyxiate because they can't survive in the air. But you don't have to shecht fish. So, and the question, of course, is that being cruel to the fish? I guess is a question, but I think fish are not considered to be intelligent enough to be able to figure that one out. So octopuses are obviously, or octopi are intelligent. We know that, but we're not allowed to eat them anyway. So, okay. If there's no, I think I'm going to
Like-
end on this note as far as the recording is concerned. So I'm going to stop the
But
recording.
did you?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead. If you want to
That
say
doesn't
something for the record,
question.
yeah.
Doesn't answer the question. Are they? Can you eat them? You know, alive?
I don't think a Jew could. I'm pretty sure a Jew would not be allowed to eat it alive.